Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is my New York. How about a break from home sheltering? Let's take a walk, a virtual walk, to a particular block on Riverside Drive. Consider these townhouses, stately relics of Beaux Arts, New York. Their elegant rooms have hosted movie stars and murderers, scientists, industrialists, a Nobel Laureate in literature, and a gangster named Benny the Bum. Juicy tales, delightfully told in this book, The Man with the Sawed-Off Leg, by veteran New York Times writer and editor Dan Wakin. And Dan's also going to tell you how the number 2 pencil figures into this mix. Next. Dan Wakin, what a delight to meet you. I wish it was in person instead of virtual.
Likewise,
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, a little busy, but doing well.
I'm sure you are. The book is just delightful. I really love a book where I learn things. It's informative, but it's a fun read as well. And this certainly was that.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And how can you get any better than Benny the Bum? What I'd like you to do is just give our audience a thumbnail profile of him before we come back to the whole story of him in 334. And
Sure. So Benny grew up on the sort of the west side, over by the docks. His father was a bartender and had a bar, and he tended bar for a while, and then kind of got into other more lucrative trades like stick-ups, running liquor during Prohibition. He also did a little head knocking for the dock bosses, and he graduated to bigger and better things.
worked for Legs Diamond, I think you.
Yeah, he was on the sort of the outer circle of legs, when it's kind of muscle for legs.
Yeah, well, he found his way to other things, which is maybe, I guess, the centerpiece of the book, which is the heist at the armored car heist at the ice warehouse out in Brooklyn, which leads him to 334
Right.
Riverside Drive eventually. But before we get to that and the drama involving that, let's talk about these buildings for a minute. They go from 105th to 106. The numbers are 330 to 337, so the audience will know what we're both talking about when we use those numbers. I remember an old TV program that used to say there are 8 million stories in the naked city. How did you come on these? Why these townhouses?
Well, it was really trying to figure out what were the stories of those 8 million that took place behind this brick and limestone. So I grew up around the corner from these buildings, and I spent my whole childhood, my whole life at various times walking past them, often walking the dog, and then moved away, and then for various reasons ended up moving back into my old apartment. They were so familiar to me, these things that are sort of indelibly part of your brain. And then it occurred to me, I knew nothing about what was behind those walls. I knew the exteriors intimately, but I didn't know what happened behind them. And it was this kind of curiosity about that. And so I started just doing some casual searches on newspaper websites. I began looking more deeply into the people whose names popped up behind this row of buildings. Now, these are wonderful buildings. They're landmarked. They're very unique, and it's really the only remaining row of townhouses left on Riverside Drive. So there's something special about them.
What a cast of characters you bumped into once you began looking into.
Exactly.
Benny the Bum we've already talked about, but you've got everybody from Marion Davis to Duke Ellington to Julia Marlowe to a Japanese scientist who I guess discovered adrenaline.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Let's get back to Benny and how he got to 334 Riverside, which I think is sort of in the middle of the group of them.
Correct.
And that armored car heist out in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was 1934. Benny and his friend, they were walking around Bath Beach, Brooklyn, thinking that they'd stick up some bathhouses. Then they saw an armored car make a stop at a bank and thought, well, wait, let's rob the bank. They looked around at the bank. They realized it's a crowded area, not a great idea. How about the armored car? So they followed the armored car, saw its route, saw roughly the places that it stopped, and realized that one of its stops was at a very remote ice house. It's an ice warehouse because at the time, people didn't have electric refrigerators. They had ice boxes, and the Iceman would deliver a block of ice. And so this ice house was a regular repository of a cash pickup. So they devised a very elaborate plan to hold up the armored car, and then escape across Gravesend Bay.
They're going to make their escape back to the city by water.
Exactly. That way they could elude any police chase, because they figured the cops would never expect them to flee by boat. So they had a highly worked out plan that involved 10 people in the gang. Everybody had their role. It went perfectly smoothly. They got about, I think, $437,000 roughly from the armored car, which at the time was the largest amount of money ever taken in an armored car robbery in U.S. history. They loaded the money into 2 boats and then motored across Gravesend Bay to the Rockaways, where the plan was then to leave and head back to Manhattan. Well, the only thing that went wrong in this whole robbery was when McMahon had a shotgun, and the shotgun got tangled up in a rope. So he was trying to.
Let me just interrupt and remind the folks that McMahon is Benny the Bum.
Correct. So Benny the Bum, and I guess we'll find out why he's a bum in a second. The shotgun got tangled in the rope. He tried to untangle it and accidentally shot himself in the leg. So all hell breaks loose at this point. The robbers realize Benny's bleeding pretty badly and they've got to take care of him. So everybody else disperses except for a couple of them. One of them gets a bottle of whiskey for Benny from a local bar. Another one finds a car, and they manage to drive Benny to a safe house. This is a house that, it's a tenement, former townhouse that's run by a woman named Madeline Tully, who's pretty well known at the time in the underworld as both a madam of a brothel, but also someone you could trust. You could leave guns with. You could, trust her to hide you if you needed it. And Madeline Tully's safe house was 334 Riverside Drive.
Mm-hmm.
So Benny's bleeding pretty badly. So they call a doctor they know who's kind of, knows how to treat underworld figures. He comes in, nothing much you can do. Benny's, bleeding terribly, can't staunch the bleeding, so he amputates the leg.
That's the great title of the book.
Right, The Man with the Sawed-Off Leg, right, exactly. So Benny bleeds to death. He doesn't make it. By the way, I might add, while this is all going on, the doorbell rings and everybody freezes. One of the gangsters goes downstairs, looks through the curtain in the window, and he sees a police officer kissing a woman who had leaned against the bell, the buzzer. And so, very quick thinking guy, he opens the door and says, "Officer, what are you doing here? How dare you do something like that? Don't you have any dignity?" And so, of course, the cop runs away, and things proceed. Now, so Benny is dead, and they have to get rid of the body. So the solution is to put him in a steamer trunk and, send him off. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't fit into the steamer trunk, so they have to amputate the other leg. Some days later, the steamer trunk is found in a sort of an areaway in front of a building in the 60s on the west side. So he didn't really do a very good job of disposing of the body.
Well, I have to say that, I guess the newspapers at the time, and still do, love a great crime story, and they love this one.
Sure.
And even some of the authorities you write about were impressed by the complexity of the plan.
Yeah, it was called the crime of the century, as big crimes are often called. There was an enormous amount of press for this case. It was on the front pages of papers for days, and it was carried by newspapers around the country through wire service reports. You know, for a year there were continual references to that possibly they had suspects. Some money was found. Maybe there's a connection to a crime syndicate. So there's a lot of speculation because the police did not make public what they had, and there didn't seem to be a breakthrough. But all along they were investigating. They pretty early on had an idea of who was involved. It was just a question of gathering the evidence.
The mayor got very prominently involved with the party of making public statements demanding that
Exactly.
the guy, the gang be caught.
Exactly. It was such a brazen crime, and it was so well planned and carried out that I think the police really took it as a high priority, something that they had to show they could crack, because otherwise it would have been a slap in the face. Eventually, some of the gangsters made it to Gangbusters. I don't know if any of your viewers will remember that radio show.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So a movie was eventually made, by the way, in 1950 called Armored Car Heist, which doesn't bear much resemblance to it, but was inspired by it. There was also, the old true crime magazines, True Detective. Yes. They featured this case, and eventually, right before the trial, a few years later, the New Yorker magazine did a two-part piece, part one and part two magazine articles about this whole saga, and that was a great source for me, by the way.
Well, there's even more about number 334 Riverside, but let's move on to 331 down the block, Marion Davies.
Right. She was the mistress of William Randolph Hearst. And if people have seen the movie Citizen Kane, they'll get the impression that the main character's wife, Kane's wife, Susan Alexander, might have been Marion Davies. And there's a little bit of resemblance. She was, Marion Davies was an actress. I think Susan Alexander was supposed to be an opera singer, but a bad one. And Marion Davies was considered not a great actress, even though Hearst was pushing her. Hearst had a movie studio and a huge publicity machine through his newspapers. He was pushing her to be a star, but he wanted her to be a serious actress. But she wasn't. She was actually a very gifted comedian, and her comic roles are really quite wonderful. It's the strange thing about Hearst is, he didn't want anybody to know he had a mistress because he had a wife and family 20 blocks away. At the same time, his mistress had to be someone, had to be a personage, couldn't just be a former chorus girl.
I talked in the opening about the number 2 pencil is involved here. And that's 335 Riverside Drive, after a woman named Julia Marlowe,
right,
who was great Shakespearean actress, right?
Right. She was, she's completely forgotten now, but at the time in the 1890s, first years of the 20th century, she was really considered, our greatest Shakespearean actress.
In any case, the Fabers move into 335.
Right. They move in, they buy the building from Julia Marlowe. I think around 1909 or so. And that family goes back to the 1760s. One of their ancestors started the pencil business in Germany, and it just was passed down through the generations. And Lothar Faber, who bought with his wife 335, he's the grandson of one of the Fabers who came to the U.S. to establish the business in the U.S. And he and his brother Eberhard, another name you've seen on a pencil, ran the company, and then Eberhard died, and then Lothar took over and was the president of the company, and they lived there into the 40s. And that is really one of the most interesting stories, because there were at least 2 memoirs came out from that family of later generations, writing about life in that house and writing about the family, and they're really wonderful. And that was a great find to discover these. these memoirs.
Yeah. We have the Pencil family, and a little bit up the block we have the baking powder family at
Right.
number 330.
Many of your viewers who live in New York and in the New York area, if they go to the supermarket and they go to the baked goods sections and they're looking for what you need, flour, sugar, whatever, they'll look for baking powder. And one of the most common kinds of baking powder that you'll find even today is Davis baking powder. The label is instantly recognizable. It's yellow. It's a red, it has a red circle in the middle, and it says Davis
package.
Yeah. So around early 1900s, 1910 or so, 1908, Robert Benson Davis buys 330 Riverside Drive. Now, Robert Benson Davis was a Civil War veteran, decorated, a hero, from upstate New York, comes to New York, establishes a dry, goods business, or works as, with a merchant. It's a little murky. We don't know about his early years, but eventually establishes in the early 1880s this baking powder company in Hoboken. And it's a huge hit. He's a tremendous businessman. He sells an enormous amount of baking powder and really becomes quite wealthy. And so when he's in his 40s or 50s, he decides he needs to get married. So he finds a wife, 18-year-old woman, Jenny Weed, and she becomes Jenny Davis, and marries her and installs her in this beautiful, it's probably the most beautiful house on the block. Then something goes wrong in the marriage, and there's a spate of newspaper reports about their divorce. In a lot of ways, we have reality television sort of exposing the lives of the rich and famous. Well, big divorce cases among the wealthy and the well-known were the version of that in the 1910s and 1920s. Highly publicized, every court date was covered. So the stories about the Davises were basically, the storyline was he was being abused by a cruel wife who was seeking to take over his business and have him declared legally insane. And there's stories of him escaping by dropping his address or dropping the keys to the house to a Confederate who, and then he sneaks out when the cooks are away, that we're supposed to keep an eye on him, and he's driven off to New Jersey to escape. And this is sort of the narrative in the newspapers. So it was very juicy stuff. It was great. And then amazingly, I got in touch with a descendant of the Davis family who had a whole cachet of letters from the wife, from Jenny, which is a very different story.
I can't imagine that as you began your investigation into these buildings, you had any notion you were going to come up with a cast of characters like this. You got industrialists, you got scientists, you've got the mistress, the people we've talked about. Is it, I'm not a novelist, and I don't think you are either. I don't know if we could have invented a group like that.
No, it's true. And, there's, I sort of divide them up in my mind into three groups. There's the gangsters, there are the artists and the cultural figures, and there are the industrialists, the businessmen, the people that build. And you have these three groups all living together on the exact same block. And it's kind of,
yes. And what do you think it was about these buildings? These are buildings built, at the turn of the last century, in the 1890s to 19. What was it about this block and these buildings that attracted these people?
Well, one thing was the Riverside Drive at the time was being touted as the next Fifth Avenue, as the next place where wealthy people could come and establish beautiful homes. And it was a status symbol to be on Riverside Drive. At least that's what the marketers were trying to tell you. Now, it didn't quite work out that way, but I think it was seen as a place for people that might have been excluded from Fifth Avenue, who, might not have been very welcomed in those circles. Because don't forget, a lot of these people, and this is, again, part of why this is a great New York story. A lot of these people were immigrants. You know, the
Mhm.
favorites.
Outsiders. They're outsiders.
Outside, exactly. They're outsiders.
New York society, could we still refer to it as the 400 back then?
At the time, it was the 400, exactly. And these people were not going to be admitted into the 400. So this was a place where they could go and actually buy beautiful homes for a reasonable amount of money on a supposedly beautiful site. And it is beautiful. I mean, it's overlooking the Hudson River and the Palisades of New Jersey. The drawback was that the railroad ran down below along the river, and a lot of the trains would belch smoke, and they were carrying a lot of the the goods to the slaughterhouses and back from the slaughterhouses down the Lower West Side. So it was smelly. So it wasn't perfect, but it was a place where aspiring New Yorkers or New Yorkers aspiring to higher society and to ostentation could come to.
I have not mentioned so far the Nobel Laureate who was in 333 Riverside for a while. And we should say, I guess these buildings went through changes. They were the grand dames that we still see. And then there was a period where they were like chopped up and made into apartments. And Saul Bellow at 333 wrote all of or part of Seize the Day.
I think he wrote all of it. Yeah, he was there for the entire writing of it. Fairly certain, it's not quite clear, but it seemed that he was there long enough and he was starting it when he wrote a letter to to a friend describing how grief-stricken he was by the death of his father, and that this book somehow reflected that. And the book is really about a strained relationship between a father and son. And at the time, I'm pretty certain, I haven't, wasn't able to nail this down specifically, but I believed it was owned by Duke Ellington, because Duke Ellington owned 334 and also 333 at one time. And they were effectively his headquarters. That's where his publishing company was based. And his sister Ruth, who lived in 334 with her family, was president of the publishing company. And eventually, the Duke turned over ownership of one to his son, Mercer Ellington, and the other to his sister Ruth. And they, lived there and stayed there and eventually sold them.
I think, Dan, there's another book. I'd like to know more about Saul Bellow and his time on the Upper West Side, and I don't know how he interacted with the neighborhood, if indeed he did. But I guess that's for another book.
That's another literary endeavor. I mean, what you said is very interesting about the transformation of these buildings, because again, what I hope to convey in this book is that it's really a story more of New York City as much as anything.
Sure.
And these buildings sort of go through the cycles that New York City goes through, really. I mean, they started out as elegant, beautiful townhouses, right? To be sold to individuals and to families. Then some of them stay in families into the 1940s, then are sold and broken up and become apartments. Others of them immediately fall in hard times, like 334, where the gangsters were. It was sort of stayed as a rooming house next door to the fancy family-owned townhouses. And then a couple of others were owned by institutions, by the Catholic Church, by the New York Buddhist Church, and they stayed pretty much intact. And then some of the.
How familiar are you with the current residents? I know, as you said earlier, you live around the corner. How well do you know the folks now?
Well, so some of them that were rooming houses came back to be single-family homes, or was renovated and restored as single-family homes, as happens. And one of them on the corner was turned into a single-family home by Edgar Bonfman and his wife at the time, Sherry Bonfman. And I know, I chat with Sherry on the street, and I've talked to a woman in 335, the former Pencil building, right, who converted into a single-family home. She's a former Columbia professor. And then the one of the buildings became a dojo where my son took karate lessons. I used to go there all the time. And then the building on the corner is fascinating. 330, the baking powder King's building. That his daughter lived there, Lulu, who was kind of a sort of a poor little rich girl character who stayed there into the 50s. and sold it to an order of the Catholic Church, which then sold it to another order, not exactly an order, but an organization called Opus Dei, which your viewers may know about, and which owns it still. So that building has really had only 3 owners from the very beginning. And it's remained amazingly intact. But then amazingly, there were a whole series of pictures, of photographs that they had in a book that had been left there that were of the original Davis family and the Davis home. If you look at these photographs from 1912, it's incredible how similar the house is to then. It's like walking into a time capsule. You know, wow. Some of the same furniture, the same decor on the walls. The main rooms are unchanged, the same murals on the walls in the dining room. So it's really like walking back into time.
What a rollicking collection of stories this is, and it's delightful to spend time with you talking about it. The book is The Man with the Sawed-Off Leg, Dan Wakin. Thank you so much. I hope you'll write another and come see us again.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to come back.
All right. See you then. And we thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.